delighted to introduce Edward Shirley Price, who is the parent of a child with a recently diagnosed condition. And he's going to give us a very important, a very central perspective, that of the parent, that of the family. So, Edward, over to you.
Thank you for SWAN today for inviting me along. I'm just going to spend the next sort of 20 minutes or so basically giving a sort of family story of Alicia, and just sort of giving a run through of Alicia's journey between now and the age she is, which is now 10. So this is Alicia. She's 10 years old. She also has a younger sister called Isabel, who's 7 and is absolutely fine, no problems. And also Mum, Stephanie. I won't divulge Mum's name, but she's in the audience as well today. So I'm just going to give a story of Alicia's life, and hopefully some of the experiences we went through with the child without a diagnosis may resonate with some of you, especially perhaps some of the parents. So just to give a bit of background, Alicia had a sort of relatively complicated pregnancy and birth. I say complicated from our perspective as parents. Obviously, she was our first-born child. And my wife was sick in the pregnancy from beginning right through to the end. She also seemed to be very, very tired. I know that all pregnant mums get very, very tired, but when we sort of spoke to our pregnant peers, our other friends and colleagues, she seemed to be kind of excessively tired. And actually, it transpired afterwards that Steph actually had an underactive thyroid, which may have been cause of during the pregnancy or before, we just didn't know. From a very early stage, the first sort of 3 to 6 months of Alicia's life, she was a normal baby, sort of, a gurgling baby, everything kind of seemed okay. But then after the age of about sort of 9, 10 months, we realized that she was perhaps behind in terms of her developmental assessment. She didn't walk until she was sort of nearly 2 years old and didn't crawl until before that, so under 15 months. But as first-time parents, it was all a bit unknown. We didn't, know, was that normal, was that not normal, how things were. And actually a lot of our friends and colleagues were just kind of labelling us as perhaps competitive parents. She was a child that will grow. All kids learn at their own stages in life and at different stages in life, so we were just kind of being competitively. And just to give a quick 5-10 second, if this works hopefully, a 10-second video of Alicia. I hope you can see this. It's a bit dark. But essentially, kind of night after night after night, we had to cope with this. We thought originally it was just tantrums, but the doctor's saying it wasn't tantrums. It was just her, and this is Alicia about the age of kind of 3 or 4, probably 4 or 5 nights a week until she was maybe 4 or 5 years old. We had this kind of episode. And again, this was just kind of how she was. So again, from our perspective, we thought, was that just kind of normal? Was that the normal way that all kids are at that age? And that was one of those things. So we had lots of discussions with the hospitals and the various authorities at that time. Then at about 2 years old, we kind of knew we had to do something, and we had lots of, again, discussions with the hospitals. And at 2 years old, she was diagnosed with global developmental delay. And, for us initially as parents, we kind of perhaps didn't believe it. We had a child that was seemingly normal, apart from the label GDD, global developmental delay. There didn't seem to be anything else wrong. We didn't even know what GDD was, to be honest. So, after this kind of initial, news sank in, we then kind of had a half acceptance of GDD, and we then kind of started down the track of working with the authorities and understanding what this meant for Alicia and what this may mean for her life and indeed our lives. And, like all parents, there were challenges. There were challenges with Alicia herself and the amount of hospital visits as well. It was also very difficult for Alicia's younger sister to adjust. I mean, in the first few years, it was fine. But then as Isabel started to kind of grow and realise that, her older sister was kind of slightly different and slightly unusual, it became quite a kind of challenge from that perspective. And ultimately, actually, Isabel, from a parent perspective, overtook Alicia in her developmental age and began sort of almost a junior caring role. So it then transpired to be something quite different again. And we just weren't sure if we were going to be in limbo like this for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, this was how it's going to be, or were things going to develop any kind of differently from that perspective? So we had lots of discussions with the authorities, and we talked quite strongly and firmly with many authorities, either in the local councils, the sort of and the hospitals and everybody else in the trust. And we did find it from a parent perspective quite frustrating that some of the professions kind of are asking us, well, what difference will a diagnosis make to you? What does it kind of matter? You will always get the support from the various regulations and authorities, which to a point, that is true. But for us and for parents, and I must stress, this is from our perspective, not necessarily all parents who may not want a diagnosis, but we did. And for us to have a diagnosis, it was critical because it gave us, like I'm kind of saying here on the bullets, it gave you that starting point, that way of narrowing down into a focus of research we could look at. We just didn't know, with the raft of issues that Alicia had, we didn't know where to start anywhere. It also gave us, a diagnosis would give us an indication of Alicia's future, what things we may have to plan for her. It also would give us an indication of any other family members that could be affected. Would Isabel be affected by this at some point in the future? Would Isabel's children be affected by this? These are all things that we had as kind of questions. We also knew that with a diagnosis, there would be potentially a label that would then form a group, and the support group would be there to provide us with potentially support for that particular diagnosis we had. And at the moment, it was quite difficult to work with some of the authorities when you didn't have a label, because it was kind of knowing where to turn and where to go from that perspective. And finally, it would give us a future as parents and family, where were we going to go? Decisions we made in life for the next 10, 15, 20 years, some of the bucket list things we had may be different, or a different change of direction compared to if we had a diagnosis of what we knew with Alicia, and it may change our kind of family life altogether. And when we pushed and we did push hard for a diagnosis with the authorities, I think they kind of got tired with us in the end. Some of the professionals sort of came back and said, well, I think autism would be the best label to give to Alicia. And again, we were being quite dogged in our response on that, because even though we wanted a diagnosis, it wasn't about the label, it was about a diagnosis. And we knew that Alicia had traits of autism, but also traits of ADHD, fine and gross motor skills. She had sort of tremor. She was developmentally half her age, so it wasn't just autism. So we were kind of keen to push back to the authorities there and the various doctors and say, it's not just autism, kind of what is it? And we also asked the question of various people as well, that if we won the lottery, if we had all the money in the world, if we could fly to America, Canada, Scotland, the Middle East, and take Alicia there to other professions around the world, would that help? Is that something we could look at? But the answer again was kind of no, or unknown from that perspective. So it was quite a frustrating time. This slide I've called Managing the Minefield. Excuse the play on words there. I'm not going to kind of dwell on it, but again, it was just points that we found difficult to manage within the system. So difficult for parents to obtain the full end-to-end level of information. From that perspective, I think we felt there wasn't a sort of an overall umbrella view of all the advice and help we could have for Alicia. Whether it was discussions around the medical profession, speech therapy, portage, orthotics, the continence nurse, all these things that we did at the time didn't know existed, but now we kind of do, and there was no one to really kind of glue all this stuff together. So we sort of developed, in a way, almost project management skills, and I think as parents you kind of have to, and I think the system, and when I call the system, I mean everything kind of within the NHS or the people there to kind of help you. It is a collection of dedicated, very, very caring professionals that are there to kind of help and support you. There's no doubt about that. We found that everywhere we looked. But also, there can be some operations within silos. These groups of dedicated professions do operate in silos. And I think, there is that missing from our perspective as parents, that umbrella view of kind of managing the whole end-to-end side of things. And, I do not believe that parents should treat the relationship with a kind of patient-doctor relationship. I think it should be a partnership between the authorities and the parents. And I think in some respects the parents need to kind of bridge that gap and step up and be the glue between that to make sure they're kind of asking all these questions they need to ask. And of course, that was an immense amount of help we had through all the NHS and the various doctors we've seen over the years. As well as I say here, outside of the medical profession, there is other parents, which was a huge amount of resource and help that we were kind of given, and also more recently with the help we've had from SWAN. In terms of Alicia's school, it was again a kind of a personal choice in terms of what we felt and we wanted. We were still being told, and obviously at this age Alicia's kind of 4 going on 5, we were still being told by some people that, you know, she might catch up, she might just be having a bit of a, you know, a tough time, and she will eventually catch up. So we wanted to provide her with kind of, in speech marks, normal peers for her to kind of go to school with. We wanted to provide that overall normality in her life and see how she got on in a mainstream school. And the school she went to was actually a school in Nottingham, and they provided excellent, you know, really first-class support. They provided 2 teaching assistants that were really great with Alicia, and she was a really kind of loved kid throughout that school. She was amongst a very few other kids that kind of had special needs, and she made a big impact on the school actually, as well as the school making a big impact on her life. But again, with parents, there's always challenges on that side as well, and some of the challenges we experienced by going to a mainstream school was some of the, you know, the school activities outside school were limited. You know, when kids were going on a trip somewhere, it was always a bit more challenging with Alicia. Do we have the right support to go with her? You know, other parents wanted to invite Alicia to their houses, but they weren't quite sure perhaps how to deal with that, or if there was an issue. And sometimes Alicia was never really purposely destructive, but she might go around the house and find all your ornaments and find all your DVDs and everything would be out on the floor. And other parents were kind of struggling to understand that a little bit. And I think as parents as well, with a child, you know, with developmental delay or some special needs, that it could be quite easy to become a bit reclusive, you know, because of those reasons, because of other parents potentially do find it difficult or challenging. It is quite easy to become reclusive, so you have to try extra kind of hard. And then ultimately in school, we quite often hear this phrase that inclusion becomes exclusion. And essentially what we're kind of saying there, that, you know, Alicia, although she had this fantastic support at school, there came a point where, you know, you're 6 or 7, 8, 9, and the other children are, you know, learning about the kind of, you know, the fall of the Roman Empire, and Alicia is still learning how to write her name or kind of colouring in some of the books. So she's isolated within that school classroom environment, which meant that kind of inclusion did become exclusion. And ultimately, at the age of kind of 8 or 9, we took the decision to move Alicia to a special needs school. So it was this summer that, and Alicia's been on the DDD study. She's been on the DDD study for about 2 years. And it was this summer we were called into Dr. Suri's office, who was our genetic professor at the time. And he called us into his office saying that he may have found something on the study that could relate to Alicia. And I remember myself and Stephanie, my wife, sat in that office as Dr. Suri told us, but basically what Alicia had was a problem with one of her genes, STXBP1, and you know, this is probably the underlying cause of what Alicia has. And it was kind of, I put there a memory etched. It was something that's a time stamp on our brains of, okay, this is great. We now kind of relax. We can now understand what this is. We know we almost had a diagnosis from that perspective. I remember the first thing we left the office, and my wife said to me, you know, didn't you once have an STXBP1 Yamaha motorcycle? And of course, I sort of said, don't be so silly, I always had Suzuki's, right? So I didn't know that. But this did immediately relax us, because not only we sort of knew what it was, but we perhaps knew what it wasn't. So, you know, we knew that it was not a family genetic issue, sort of carried down from ourselves, if you like. We knew it wasn't because of the difficult pregnancy, or indeed we also had a difficult birth. We knew it wasn't because of the underactive thyroid that Steph suffered as part of the pregnancy. We knew it wasn't because we gave Alicia the MMR vaccine. Some of you remember that was kind of a controversial thing there, or other vaccines. You know, you become paranoid as parents to all these things that it could be. And we also believed that this was not going to be regressive. So it was, you know, these are all the facts that we then knew. And it was, in fact, genetic. And for us as parents, and I must stress again, this is for us, you know, this is why it was important for us to have a diagnosis. All these unanswered questions that we had, we could then relate to and discuss. And it gave us the next chapter in our lives as well, in terms of now we have this diagnosis, we can really zone in and start thinking about what help we can provide Alicia, why she is the way she is, and potentially any future things that we could look at. So, based on some of the experiences we had, I just thought it might be useful to put down a couple of bullets that might you know, help other parents that are kind of navigating their way through. And you know, some of these things that we've got here is, you know, you do have to really be determined. You know, with working and everything in the authorities with your child, you know your child better than anyone, and they can only rely on you to kind of fight for them from that perspective. You know, don't be afraid to keep asking the doctors and the medical professions. You know, it's very, very tricky because they, you know, using very, very big words that I don't understand. And you know, you have to kind of really break it down where you can, and sort of say we come to various points with Alicia where it was kind of a bit of a full stop. We've done this testing, and there's nowhere else we can go, and we kind of then have to keep asking the question, well, what's next then? What's the next step, and why? Why are you choosing that level of kind of scrutiny over something else? And I think also we did a lot of research ourselves, and again we found that was great. Some of the consultants and doctors we spoke to, they really kind of encouraged that. Other ones were kind of like, well, Google tells you nothing, it's just full of other stuff. And you have to filter that out yourself. You know, you have to do as parents the research. Again, it's part of the kind of partnership between you and the doctors and making sure you're doing the best for your child. And I think we also researched, you know, a lot of the kind of softer support items. You know, Alicia did a lot of picker eating, so she used to kind of pick everything up and just in her younger years and just kind of eat it. And you kind of work out, doing the research, how can that be? What things can kind of help stop picker eating? You know, where can you get swimming costumes that have nappy built in that give us some sort of dignity in a swimming pool? And I think you have to ask your parents and relatives and friends, anyone, for as much help as you can possibly gain, because it is tough as parents, you know, bringing up a child with special needs. There's no doubt about it. So from our perspective, the future I put there is kind of, you know, uncertain yet more certain. I mean, Alicia now is in a great school in Hampshire. We've moved down to Hampshire, and she is in a special needs school there. She's extremely happy. She's doing extremely well. We've got a fantastic team of, you know, professionals that have built all around us. It did take a few years to build, but we now know exactly kind of who to turn to for everything. And this in turn has also taken a huge amount of pressure off us as parents. You know, we know who to speak to. The school provides immense support, and this has really kind of helped us as parents. And there's always going to be some unknowns. You know, we would like ultimately for Alicia to be as independent as possible in the future. All parents would. We're hoping that can be the case. You know, historical evidence there would suggest that she will continue to learn. She's learned at her own pace. It's obviously well behind the speed of other children, but she is continuing to learn. And we can always live in hope that now we have a diagnosis, now we know what STX-BP1 is, which is not a Yamaha. We now know that this is something we can focus on, and we now know that this is something we can look into, and potentially future fields and future medical advances may provide further information to that. Again, this is very kind of hot off the press from our perspective. And from our view, you know, kind of what's around the corner, I guess. Well, I guess any of us, you know, for any of us, what's around the corner, what's kind of next for us, no one really knows. But having a child like Alicia, even with a diagnosis, there are kind of various certainties in life, I guess, from that perspective. You know, she will remain in a special needs school. She will need support from the authorities probably for the rest of her life. And hopefully, as I say, she will continue to learn. But at least now we can plan with a little more future and clarity on where we're going and what we're looking at with Alicia and how it interacts with her and her younger sister Isabel as well. So these are all things that we really have a kind of positive outcome from our perspective about having a diagnosis. And finally, I'd just like to say, on behalf of Alicia, thank you to SWAN for inviting her along and letting her tell her story. I'd also like to thank my wife in the audience today for her tireless dedication to this, and also my younger daughter Isabel, who's been such a kind of gem through some difficult childhood times. From her perspective, it's quite challenging. And I think if there's ever to be a kind of a benchmark for resilience and tolerance and patience and having such a kind, unprejudiced heart, I think Isabel would certainly be it as a younger daughter. And I think I'd also just like to say thank you to all of you in the audience for listening, and for those of you that are going through your own journeys, whether it's at the beginning or whether it's kind of ongoing. I wish you all the very, very best. And it's fantastic to know that groups such as SWAN are here to provide that support and advice if we need it as parents. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Edward, for that inspiring and encouraging story. And we, I think, all admire you for the clarity with which you relate your experience. There is a couple of minutes for any questions or comments, if anyone would like to ask.
You found anyone with the same mutations?
So the question was, have we found anyone with the same mutations?
Yeah.
No, we, as I say, it was only in the summer that we found this. So, and in fact, interestingly today, looking at some of the previous speakers and one of the slides that came up of all the mutations on the genes there, we saw Alicia's gene, I think it was about number 4 along here, that was STXBP1. And I noticed, I think there were either 6 or 9 other, I guess, children of people that were associated with that. So when we first spoke to Dr. Zuri, he said that obviously this was confidential and parents and individuals didn't know each other's information. But I think there was going to be some potential views in the future whereby he would form like a central group and we could ask other parents how their children are getting on and what things that they found. So that's something in the future that we're going to look at, certainly. But as it stands today, no, we don't know anybody else that's got the same gene issue.
But of course, now that you know there are others out there, that becomes an option, a possibility, if the other families wish to share it with you.
Definitely, yes.
Good.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's an example of one of the, as it were, non-medical things that comes out from the research as well as the medical. Any other questions or comments? No? Excellent.
Okay.
Good.
Thank
Well,
you.
In that case, we will move on. Thank you very much again.